What Patton did when his soldiers found 12 German boys armed with rifles and abandoned by their commander April 1945. A defensive position near Erfurt, Germany. Rain falls on a muddy line of freshly dug trenches, turning the earth into gray soup. An American platoon moves through the tree line, rifles raised, checking the perimeter. Sudden gunfire breaks the silence, bullets clipping the branches above. The Americans hit the dirt, return fire instantly, and advance on the position with overwhelming force. They overrun the trench line in less than 3 minutes, ready to clear out hardened enemy combatants. Instead, the gunfire stops, replaced by a sound none of the veteran soldiers expected. It is the sound of weeping. Inside the deep mud of the trench stand 12 German soldiers. 3 are already dead, and 2 are bleeding from bullet wounds. The remaining 7 are crying openly, clutching heavy rifles that are physically taller than they are, their oversized steel helmets falling over their eyes. General Patton will soon discover the monstrous truth behind this desperate defense, and he will ensure the man responsible faces a reckoning that mirrors the exact cowardice of his crime. What Patton did when his soldiers found 12 German boys armed with rifles and abandoned by their commander April 1945. A defensive position near Erfurt, Germany. A cold rain slicked the mud inside a narrow trench line. An American infantry squad approached the ridge with bayonets fixed and weapons hot. They had just taken heavy rifle fire from this exact position. They expected a desperate, hardened pocket of German resistance holding out until the bitter end. Instead, they find 12 German soldiers huddled together. 3 are already dead, staring blankly at the sky. 2 are bleeding from shrapnel wounds. Moaning into the dirt, the rest are weeping. They are holding rifles that are physically taller than they are. Their green helmets slip completely over their eyes when they move. They are not men. They are boys between 14 and 16 years old. A single question from a crying child will soon reach the Third Army commander, sparking a response that changed everything. Sergeant Thomas Alvarado was 26 years old, from Tucson, Arizona, serving with the veteran infantry of the Third Army. He had been fighting continuously since his boots hit the bloody sand of Normandy. He had watched close friends die in the hedgerows, survived the freezing hell of the Ardennes, and killed enemy soldiers in brutal, close-quarters combat. He was a hardened combat leader who understood the grim realities of total war, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the sight inside that muddy trench. He stood with his rifle lowered, looking down at shivering children who wore oversized helmets and carried weapons they could barely lift. The reality of what he was witnessing froze him in his tracks. This discovery would instantly change the nature of his mission, from a standard assault to a desperate frontline rescue operation. Hauptmann Otto Reinhardt was 42 years old, a regular Wehrmacht officer, originally from Cologne, Germany. He was a proud product of the traditional military establishment, deeply indoctrinated in the belief that personal survival was secondary to the preservation of the Reich's borders. His tailored uniform was immaculate, and his high leather boots were carefully polished despite the surrounding sea of mud. He wore the Iron Cross proudly on his chest, a symbol of an elite status he believed raised him far above ordinary men. When he was assigned 12 young Volkssturm conscripts, he did not see children who needed protection. He saw expendable instruments of war, meant to be expended for his own professional survival. His ideology dictated that everyone must sacrifice for the state, yet his own privilege allowed him to escape the very destruction he ordered others to face. He viewed these boys as nothing more than a temporary barrier to slow the American advance while he secured his own safety. By April 1945, the Allied advance into the heart of Germany was moving at a relentless pace, tearing through organized defenses and leaving the broken remnants of the German military in utter chaos. The Third Army was pushing rapidly through Thuringia, encountering a shattered nation where the traditional chain of command had completely dissolved. Communication lines were severed, supply depots were burning, and the central government in Berlin was issuing frantic, unrealistic orders to hold every square inch of ground at all costs. In this atmosphere of total collapse, standard military protocols vanished. Regular frontline units were replaced by improvised defensive pockets, scraped together from whatever personnel remained in the local areas. This desperate situation allowed an unprecedented level of breakdown to occur along the shifting front lines. Senior commanders frequently abandoned their posts to escape encirclement, while the civilian leadership began sweeping the streets for anyone capable of carrying a weapon. Across the collapsing Reich, older officers often ignored the strategic futility of the situation, choosing to sacrifice untrained locals to delay the inevitable American advance, while some frontline commanders quietly surrendered their positions to save lives. Others enforced suicidal resistance orders with brutal indifference, leaving behind a trail of needless destruction. On this day near Erfurt, the standard rules of engagement were shattered entirely by a tactical choice so severe it could not be ignored. The local American command immediately realized that this specific incident crossed a line from standard wartime resistance into absolute moral abandonment, forcing an immediate escalation up the chain of command. Sergeant Alvarado led his squad down into the muddy trench, his rifle still smoking from the brief exchange of fire. He found the terrified German children huddled together against the reinforced earthen wall. He immediately ordered his men to lower their weapons and begin securing the area. The boys were completely frozen with fear, staring up at the American uniforms through the rims of helmets that were far too large for their small heads. Alvarado knelt down beside the youngest boy, who couldn't have been older than 14. The boy looked at the sergeant's combat gear, his voice trembling violently as he spoke. "Are you going to kill us?" he asked. Alvarado reached into his pocket, pulled out a ration bar, and handed it to the child. "No, we are not going to kill you," the sergeant said. "Where is your officer?" he asked. The young boy took a bite of the food, tears streaking through the dirt on his cheeks. "He left 2 days ago," the boy answered. "He took the truck and the food," he said. The squad's medic was already working on the 2 wounded boys, wrapping them in heavy wool blankets to fight off the damp chill. A mid-rank American lieutenant walked down into the dugout, looking around at the scene with a mix of disgust and disbelief. "This is completely sick," the lieutenant said. "They left these kids with 1 round of ammunition each," he said. Alvarado stood up, his face grim as he looked at the senior officer. "These aren't soldiers, sir," the sergeant said. "These are just kids," he said. The lieutenant checked the paperwork inside the abandoned command bunker. Finding the roster left behind on the desk, the officer in charge was Hauptmann Otto Reinhardt, the lieutenant said. "He signed the order to hold the line before he drove east," he said. "He stole their food and left them to die," Alvarado said. "He ran away like a coward," he said. The lieutenant walked over to the field telephone, his hand steady as he cranked the handle to reach headquarters. "This is above our level," the lieutenant said. "We need the military police and a processing unit here immediately," he said. The operator on the other end connected him directly to the division staff. "We have a position near Erfurt, completely manned by 12 abandoned miners," the lieutenant reported. "The commanding officer fled the field and left them without food or orders," he said. The division staff took the information down quickly, recognizing the severe nature of the moral violation. "Hold your position and care for the miners," the staff officer said. "The commanding general is being notified of this situation right now," he said. The report reached Patton within the hour. General George S. Patton arrived at the Erfurt holding facility within the hour. His open-top command jeep ground to a halt in the loose gravel, kicking up dust across the courtyard. The 4 polished brass stars on his helmet caught the gray morning light, and the twin ivory-handled revolvers rested heavily against his hips. He stepped out of the vehicle with a measured, deliberate stride, his jaw set in a hard line. Every military policeman and infantryman in the compound immediately snapped to attention, the sudden silence cutting through the ambient noise of the camp. The general did not glance to the left or the right. He walked directly into the holding area, where the captured German personnel were being detained, his boots echoing loudly against the concrete floor. Patton stopped directly in front of the desk, where the newly captured Hauptmann, Otto Reinhardt, sat under guard. The general studied the officer's immaculate tailored uniform, his gaze lingering on the polished leather boots and the silver iron cross. "Are you the commanding officer of the defensive sector near Erfurt?" Patton asked. "I am," Reinhardt said, straightening his stance slightly. "Did you order the forces in that trench line to hold their ground against the advancing American infantry?" Patton asked. "Those were my explicit orders from high command," Reinhardt answered. "The defense of the Reich requires absolute sacrifice from every citizen," he said. "And where were you when the American infantry overran that position?" Patton asked. "I was executing a necessary tactical withdrawal to preserve command continuity," Reinhardt replied. Patton leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cold, level whisper that carried across the entire room. "You call running away in a stolen truck a tactical withdrawal," the general said. "You left 12 children to face veteran American assault troops with a single round of ammunition each," he said. "You stripped them of their rations so you could eat while they starved in the mud. Your regular army traditions do not apply to the total mobilization of our state," Reinhardt said, lifting his chin. "Those youths belong to the Volkssturm. They are legal combatants sworn to defend the borders, and their sacrifice is a matter of military necessity," he said. Patton did not blink. "An officer who puts uniforms on children and leaves them to die while he escapes in a supply vehicle is not a soldier," the general said. "You are a criminal who used minors as human shields to buy yourself 2 extra days of safety," he said. "Sergeant Alvarado over there has spent 10 months fighting real soldiers across Europe, yet he had to share his own rations to keep your abandoned squad from collapsing of hunger." "You have a choice," Patton said, his voice cutting through the damp air. "You will either stand outside right now and watch those children receive proper care under humanitarian rules, or you will face immediate court-martial as a common, deserting criminal. Decide now." Reinhardt looked at the general's steady gaze, his arrogance finally cracking as he lowered his eyes in silent compliance. The military police acted swiftly on the general's explicit instructions. They marched Hauptmann Otto Reinhardt out into the center of the muddy compound, forcing him to stand at absolute attention in the freezing rain. Patton gathered the entire staff, the local guards, and the surviving German boys in a wide circle to witness exactly what was about to happen. The cold air was thick with the smell of wet wool, exhaust fumes, and damp earth. Reinhardt stood stiffly, his eyes fixed ahead, trying to maintain his professional composure as his polished leather boots slowly sank into the deep mire. 2 American supply sergeants walked out to the center of the square, carrying the heavy wooden crates that Reinhardt had stolen from his own men. On Patton's direct order, they opened the containers publicly and began distributing the rations, the hot broth, and the clean wool blankets directly to the shivering 14-year-old boys. Reinhardt was forced to stand completely still, watching silently as his privileges were stripped away in front of the very children he had abandoned to die. The local German civilians and the captured regional personnel watched from the perimeter in total silence. Witnessing the total breakdown of the old military hierarchy, Patton stood on the veranda, his ivory revolvers visible, ensuring the visual lesson was driven home. Sergeant Thomas Alvarado went home to Tucson, Arizona after the hostilities concluded in Europe. He returned to a quiet life far away from the battlefields of France and Germany, marrying his childhood sweetheart and raising 3 children of his own. He lived a long and productive life as a master carpenter, refusing to speak about the horrors of the war to his neighbors or friends. However, he kept a single piece of a standard American wool blanket inside his cedar chest for the rest of his life. He died in 1988, surrounded by his family, still remembered by his old unit as a man who chose mercy in a place devoid of it. Hauptmann Otto Reinhardt was transferred to a primary military prison following a formal review of his conduct at Erfurt. A military tribunal stripped him of his rank and his decorations, sentencing him to a lengthy term of hard labor for his abandonment of minors under his direct supervision. He served 8 years in a secure detention facility before being released during the General Reconstruction period. He returned to his native Cologne and lived out his remaining years in complete obscurity, working as a clerk until his quiet death in 1971. General George S. Patton never spoke about the Erfurt incident in his public press conferences or official military briefings. He did, however, keep the local unit roster and a small wrapper from a chocolate bar inside his personal desk drawer until his fatal accident. In a private letter to his wife later that month, he wrote that a true army fights the enemy's men, not their children. What Patton did, when his soldiers found 12 German boys armed with rifles and abandoned by their commanderate, is April 1945. A defensive position near Erfurt, Germany, sits under a gray sky. An American infantry platoon moves cautiously through the damp mud, their boots heavy, their eyes scanning the tree line. Suddenly, a ragged burst of rifle fire erupts from a nearby trench. The Americans drop, return fire with heavy M1 Garand volleys, and advance swiftly to overrun the position. When they leap into the dirt, the gunfire stops entirely. Inside the trench, they do not find hardened SS elite. They find 12 German soldiers shivering in oversized uniforms. 3 are dead, 2 are bleeding out. The remaining 7 are sobbing, holding weapons taller than their bodies, their oversized helmets slipping down over their wet eyes. Their commanding officer is completely missing. General George S. Patton will soon confront the officer who weaponized children and fled. What Patton did when his soldiers found 12 German boys armed with rifles and abandoned by their commander, April 1945. A defensive position near Erfurt, Germany. Rain falls on a muddy, shallow trench line cut into the earth. The landscape seems abandoned, but a sudden burst of rifle fire shatters the cold afternoon air. An American platoon instantly drops to the ground, returns heavy fire, and advances rapidly to overrun the position. Inside the muddy trenches, the American infantrymen stop dead in their tracks, lowering their smoking weapons. They find 12 German soldiers huddled together, but they are all boys between 14 and 16 years old. 3 are already dead, and 2 lie bleeding. The survivors are weeping openly, clutching heavy bolt-action rifles taller than they are, their oversized steel helmets falling over their terrified eyes. Their commanding officer is completely missing. General George S. Patton will soon deliver a shattering lesson in accountability to the man who left children to die.